Several weeks ago, I was engaged with an individual in the comment section of a Facebook post by Reasonable Faith, Dr. William Lane Craig's apologetics ministry, as many of you will know, where we were discussing the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem and its conclusion. Well, my interlocutor sent my response to Dr. Craig, who has opted to provide a short and, I would say personally, entirely unsubstantial rebuttal, if we can call it that, to my comment. For the sake of brevity, I'm not going to read out my comment here, but I will post a link to the Reasonable Faith website where Dr. Craig posted his response in the description below. For now, I'll get right into the response that he provided. The first criticism Dr. Craig has is the perceived smugness of my response, albeit a confident response nonetheless. I don't entirely see the relevance of a perceived smugness to a reasoned response to apparently misinformation, so I'll leave this for now. You can read my comment for yourself and decide if you thought my response was smug or not. He then claims my comment was riddled with errors, which expose my claim to have studied cosmology extensively and to understand the subject well as just so much empty posturing. Well, we'll see by the end of this video who does and who does not understand the subject of disagreement. He goes on from there to mention collaborations he's had with particular physicists, which doesn't lend the credence Dr. Craig thinks it does, considering it doesn't show how anything I said was wrong. That's great that you've collaborated with physicists in the past, or even in the present day, but I'd prefer my response be addressed directly rather than one relying strictly on authorities to make their case. Dr. Craig continues by criticizing me for getting BGV theory wrong, where I typed BVG instead. This seems to me an extremely trivial grammatical error that one could easily overlook, and, in my opinion, one most likely would have, if they felt they'd had a substantive or cogent rebuttal to the comment I made, which is being responded to. Again, this is just my opinion, but people who need to nitpick at trivial grammatical errors probably don't have much in the way of a reasoned response to an argument. The first 3 points made by Dr. Craig have nothing to do with the substance of my initial comment to his reader, and seem more to me to be needlessly complaining about the particular delivery of the information contained in my comment, as well as subtle bragging, I would say, about collaborations he's had with physicists, as if it's not possible for me to either collaborate or have discussions with physicists as well, which I have. So before we dive right into the BGV theorem, let me define what it is. The BGV theorem, more technically known as the kinematic incompleteness theorem, simply states that in any classical spacetime which is expanding on the average over its history, a geodesic, or some path that something takes through this expanding spacetime, cannot be extended indefinitely into the past. This spacetime will be what's called geodesically incomplete in the past direction. Dr. Craig progresses by claiming that I've misrepresented an email exchange a blogger had with both Victor Stenger and Alexander Vilenkin, which is not the case, as one can plainly see for themselves. The blogger was pointing out that Dr. Vilenkin was asked by Mr. Stenger about whether the theorem, the BGV theorem, he co-authored with Arvind Borde and Alan Guth, proves that the universe had a beginning, which Dr. Vilenkin answers, no. Cyclic models were not even mentioned here, which raises the question why Dr. Craig is bringing them up. Does he not understand the context of the exchange here between the blogger and Dr. Vilenkin? Or is he simply unwilling to admit that his interpretation of the BGV theorem could be misguided? Moving on, Dr. Craig seems to confuse Dr. Vilenkin, saying he believes that the universe, indeed, has a beginning, with Dr. Vilenkin saying that his BGV theorem proves such is the case. These are two entirely different questions. Dr. Vilenkin has stated, as I pointed out already, and will do so again from the paper itself, that the theorem does not prove that space-time has a beginning, but that the expanding classical region of space-time must have a beginning. From the paper, quote, "What can lie beyond this boundary? Several possibilities have been discussed, one being that the boundary of the inflating region corresponds to the beginning of the universe in a quantum nucleation event. The boundary is then a closed, space-like hypersurface which can be determined from the appropriate instaton. Whatever the possibilities for the boundary, it is clear that unless the averaged expansion condition can somehow be avoided for all past-directed geodesics, inflation alone is not sufficient to provide a complete description of the universe, and some new physics is necessary in order to determine the correct conditions at the boundary." End quote. Quite honestly, Dr. Vilenkin's personal ideas about the origin of the universe aren't entirely relevant here, since we're discussing the data, or more specifically, what the BGV theorem states, not what Dr. Vilenkin's personal takes happen to be. And I would have presumed that Dr. Craig would know this. My comment was not about whether the universe had a beginning, or whether particularly Dr. Vilenkin thinks the universe has a beginning. My comment was a vitiation of the contention that the BGV theorem proves an absolute beginning to spacetime, a claim which Dr. Craig, alongside many other theistic apologists, has made on numerous occasions. Penultimately, Dr. Craig again demonstrates his seeming misunderstanding of the subject of my comment to his reader when he claims, quote, "Neither Susskind, nor Guth, nor Carroll have been able to craft a tenable model of a beginningless universe," end quote, which is ultimately beside the point. Nowhere in my initial comment did I mention that the universe is eternal, or that there are tenable models of an eternal universe, which there are. My point was simply that the BGV theorem does not prove an absolute beginning to the universe, which it doesn't. Once again, Dr. Craig misses the mark and doesn't provide a cogent rebuttal to what I'd stated in my initial comment, opting instead to refer to a point I had neither made nor defended. Dr. Craig also mentions briefly that Alexander Vilenkin has engaged directly with the Kalam cosmological argument, which is true, and that he does not dispute the second premise, which is also true. However, a third truth is that Alexander Vilenkin does not believe the Kalam cosmological argument gets you to God, nor does he believe that the BGV theorem gets you to God as well. Lastly, Dr. Craig mentions that the geodesic boundary given by the BGV theorem cannot be avoided by extending the evolution of the universe prior to the boundary, which isn't entirely true, again, from Dr. Vilenkin himself. Quote, "You can evade the theorem by postulating that the universe was contracting prior to some time," end quote. Now, we can talk about the perceived viability of these models, but that would ultimately be irrelevant. The fact is that you can develop such models. It's also worth mentioning that the only defense Dr. Craig seems to give for this contention is a quote from a cosmologist, which comes off more as a quote mine than a rational justification. I would not have expected a professional philosopher to resort to quote mines as a defense for claims he's made, but I suppose when the data is mounted against your interpretation of a scientific theorem, it's all you have left. Before I close, I did want to mention briefly that I would take some of the position that Dr. Alexander Vilenkin holds to. I personally do not think that the universe will be extended indefinitely into the past. I do think that it terminates at a finite point somewhere in the past. That is something that me and Dr. Craig would agree on. But that wasn't the substance of the comment that I had provided to his reader. It had nothing to do with whether or not the universe had a beginning, or whether or not I think, or anybody else thinks, that the universe had a beginning. It was about whether or not the BGV theorem proves that spacetime must have an absolute beginning, and I think that it is quite clear here that it does not. In closing, it seems that not only did Dr. Craig fail to provide a substantive response to the comment I gave to his reader, but as well that he completely misunderstood the nature of my comment, opting instead to defend the contention that the universe began to exist, a contention that, while I would agree with to some extent, I had never made, instead of responding to the contention I did make, that the BGV theorem does not prove that the universe began to exist. Not only did I cite directly from the paper itself to demonstrate this point, but Alexander Vilenkin, one of its authors, also explicitly answers no when he is asked the very same question by Victor Stenger. But hey, you don't have to take mine or Dr. Vilenkin's word for it. Here's PhD theoretical astrophysicist and award-winning science writer and science communicator Ethan Siegel saying as much as well. Quote, "The Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem tells us that all points in the universe, if you extrapolate back far enough, will merge together, and that inflation cannot describe a complete spacetime. But that doesn't necessarily mean an inflating state couldn't have lasted forever. It could just as easily imply that our current rules of physics are incapable of describing these earliest stages accurately, end quote. So, William Lane Craig has got to do much more if he is to substantiate properly his contention that the universe began to exist.